Let's say that a customer says, "Oh, I have a problem, right? I have a problem with in my setup or those kind of things," and it ends up with support. Then maybe the support team might look at it and go like, "Well, no, we actually told you, but you didn't read it or you missed it." Now you can of course never say that to a customer. So that's why we came up with like the customer is always right, because we had this empathy thing in the back of our minds where we said we place ourselves in the position of the customer. For whatever the fact that the customer missed this piece of information is therefore our mistake. We should have communicated it more clearly. We should have, and so on and so forth. And then you work your way back from the customers.
Welcome to Tools for Tech Leaders, a podcast for C-suite executives and tech decision makers eager to connect, share insights, and explore practical ideas and frameworks. I'm your host, Ian Tien, CEO and co-founder of Mattermost, and today we're thrilled to be joined by Bob van Luijt, CEO and co-founder of Weaviate. In a world where AI adoption defines competitive advantage, Bob solved critical bottlenecks in the AI stack years ahead of the competition. He brings a fresh perspective in making AI systems practical and useful with proprietary data and insights, and all that on an open source platform. Bob, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me, Ian. It's great to be here. This is going to be a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm so excited. We got to meet in San Francisco doing a conference, and been following Weaviate as Mattermost is open source, Weaviate's open source. Lots of really important aspects of that platform choice, being able to control your data, being able to customize, being able to do all the things, have transparency. I'd love to hear, how you kind of got here on your journey in terms of, you were studying music, you were consulting, you were doing a bunch of things. What brought you to today and the company you run?
Yeah, sure. I'm born in '85, so that means that when the year 2000 hit, the new millennium, I was 15. So, and a lot of people back then needed websites and those kind of things, and I was already playing around with. I think the first time I wrote software was that we had QBasic, and then the web, came around. So then, of course, the first language was PHP. So that's how I started. And so I started a little company, and it was tiny. It was just I was 15, but it was doing pretty well because a lot of people need a website. So I made a very basic, standard, what you saw back in the days, and that kept growing, and I started to do more back end work. At some point, I was couple years older, I got a job to do something with a system for actually driver administration. I wrote the back end, and so then it was time for me to go to college. And besides writing software, I was also making music, and in my case, my interest was in improvised music and in jazz. So I was like, okay, let's study music. And I think the trend there is on, fast forward to today. So now I'm almost 40, I'm 39 now, is that there's so many things that I came across in my journey that I just enjoy and that I like, that mostly sit or, in technology or in music. And I just, decided to pursue those things. And it was only later in life, around my early 30s, that I also really got interested in the business side of things. That was not before. I was just not that was just not an interest I had, but that was like about 10 years ago that started to grow as well. And then I was working with embedding. So I started to work with embedding in 2015. And that just marinated in the back of my head for quite some time. And then I met my co-founder, HN, and we said, hey, if people are going to adopt these things, because bear in mind, it's all pre-AI, we still call it machine learning, that kind of stuff. Like if people start to adopt these things, maybe there's like room for a nice dedicated database, to work with these embeddings. And that's how Weaviate was born. But I could have never foreseen the whole AI explosion. Right. But so that's kind of my journey in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's amazing. Fantastic. I love that. I think, you and I and many founders that are technical, we started off building products and now we're building companies. And for me, it's always about like, what are the principles I have from product design that I can go and build sort of organizations? And you mentioned you've kind of shifted. You were very technical, and now you're building businesses. What was that shift like? What did you bring with you from your past experience, and what were sort of the new things you had to learn to be a founder CEO?
Yeah, so the first thing was that I found it very hard in the beginning. So I remember that Weaviate was very small. We're like 10 people or something. And I remember that some of the engineers were discussing something that they were implementing. And I read it and I was like, I don't know what this is about. I have no clue. And that I needed to accept in my role and the role that I'd taken in the company that that was just not for me anymore. I needed to trust the people working on that to do the right thing. So that was the first step. So then I asked myself the question, like, so what does the CEO of a startup actually do? I was like, I don't know what they do. And that actually took me quite some time. So to talk to people and because in the beginning, I was helping on the technology. I was I made the website. I wrote the first documentation. I did the first meetups and that kind of stuff. And my co-founder Jen was just hardcore working on the database. So what I learned was that if you hire these people, so I started to hire people that were literally better at everything I did. So be it the documentation. I remember that the guy that I hired to work on our documentation. So I had an interview with him, and I said, "Hey, I made the documentation myself. What do you think?" And he said, "Yeah, I can see that because it hurts my eyes." So I started to hire these people who were like better at anything that I did. And then I remembered from back in the day that sometimes when I was working as a consultant, I was working for companies where leadership was not able to define or articulate a vision. That is, there's a lot of companies, and maybe people listening now to this podcast go like, yeah, that's my company, where they do something, but that with lack of vision, right? And so the first thing that I came up with was like, I am responsible for defining the vision and articulating it. And it's better to be wrong and adjust it than not articulate a vision at all. This is not to be confused with the strategy, because the strategy is how we make it actionable, right? But it's the vision. And then the second thing that I learned was the people element. It's like, we need great people to make this a success. I cannot impossibly do this alone. And so I need amazing people. So I need to make care that there's a great culture, that people want to work for the company, that they want to contribute to the company, that they have ownership in the company, and so on and so forth. And then the third thing that I learned is like, we need money, right? We need money, and in the early days, so it's like you start with nothing. So then you take your first seed check, you can start building. Then you want to scale it up, and then all of a sudden you start to sell. So the revenue comes in, and those kind of things. So that's the third one. So it's vision, people, money. It's these three things. That's what I'm responsible for, and that's what I do every day.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm just kind of curious, like, how do you run your leadership meetings? Like, you and I fly around the world all the time. Like, how do you get all your leaders? Like, how do you think about like reporting structure? Do you have lots of direct reports for folks and keep it shallow? Do you have, fewer direct reports and people are a little player coach? Like, what do you have a philosophy or a structure around? Well, how do you develop the organization?
Yes. So the first thing is that everybody who joins the company, especially in my team, right? They get 100% trust on day one. They are the expert. They get 100% trust to execute on that articulated vision, right? And have a sub strategy based on the company's strategy how to get there. That's one. The second thing related to that is that I find it very important that we have a doing rather than talking mindset. So what I did in the early days was that I introduced a cell structure. This is something that I didn't come up with. It's an old organizational style where we basically said we have teams the teams have a head, so it's represented by one person. You should be able to look at every head's title and immediately know what the team does. So if you're the head of database, that kind of says what that is, right? If you're the head of developer experience, says what it is, right? And so we did that. I was hoping that I could grow that to 150 people. I was not able to do that. So just before the end of the year, at the 100 people mark, I made a change. The heads became directors, and above directors now sit VPs. And so there's one added layer. And I can highly recommend build this from the bottom up than from the top down, because I'm an angel investor in, 2,000 companies or something. And sometimes I see these small companies of 4 or 5 people, and they go like, hey, we hired a COO, we hired a CPO. And I go like, that's great. But 7 people with 4 C-level people, what if these people are doing an amazing job, but not C-level worthy? What are you going to do? Are you going to demote them? Are you going to send them away? So focus on I would argue, that's what I did, focus on what needs to be done. Have informal titles first, just to show that structure. And when the business grows, you can start to introduce that formality when it grows, because people like to be promoted and not to be demoted. And this is a way you always promote. It's always, you introduce higher layers, right? And so that's how I think about it. What I think about other titles. So in the case of Weaviate, we have 3 titles that have an official meaning: the C-level, VP, director. For the rest, whatever people want. Titles are cheap. If somebody feels comfortable putting something fancy on their LinkedIn, fine, whatever, right? So that's how I look at the structure, the trusting the people, working with the people. But again, I must articulate a clear vision, because otherwise people are just running around randomly.
Yeah, 100%. And I'd love to learn about how you articulate that vision. So we talked about vision, talked about people, talked about finance, totally agree. When you think about the vision, I've actually doing this little thing where I'll take communications that I have or other people have, I'll run it into like an LLM, and I'll say like, what does this mean? It'll just like write out 3 pages, and sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. I always think about like, what does the vision mean? And what does the vision mean to other contexts? What does the vision mean to an engineer, to a marketing leader, to a support analyst? How do you think about how do you communicate the vision, and how do you create an environment where the entire company can align to that vision?
So I try to make sure that there's enough abstraction for people to execute in their own domains. So I like to fly pretty high in what how I articulate what we aim to do. I do use a lot of data, so to support what I'm saying, the case that I'm making. I'm also very well aware that you could probably make the exact opposite argument as well of what I'm saying. But I'm just saying, this is the conclusion of the data that I'm showing you. And so therefore, we're going to go not right, but we're going to go left, right? So I leave that abstraction because I trust that the people will figure out themselves what that means. So if you do marketing or sales, it means something different than if you are leading the research team or the database team. So I want to keep that abstraction. And if you want to, I can give you some examples. But so an example would be, so one tricky thing of going from a founder who starts in the technology to more business-oriented founder is that building great technology does not equate to building a great business, right? And so an example might be, a good example of this are frameworks. So frameworks can often tend to become wildly popular, so they shoot up. But then if you try to monetize the framework, that tends to be difficult. And there are all kinds of economic reasons for that. Now, in our case, when it comes to Weaviate, Weaviate is built based on, at the heart sit the vector index, and an index is often associated with search. But search in the world of databases has an is very important, and a lot of people need it, and people use it. But there's one interesting challenge from a business perspective, and that is that people who buy, from a psychological perspective, feel more comfortable paying you more for volume of data than anything else. So if you position a company as a search company, then it's going to be very hard to, what argument can you make if somebody has a search use case and they're happy with it, but they didn't grow in data? Are you going to say it's faster? People tend to not pay for that. So you look for use cases that grow in volume. And that is also why Weaviate is positioned, and how we grow Weaviate, as we now refer to as an AI native database, because we want to target all AI developers, right? Not only those who do specific search. It's a very important part of the database, but not exclusively. Now, this is something that I would articulate to the team, and then the team takes action on that, right? And they position it. It's product, how product evolves, how the community evolves, how documentation evolves, and so on and so forth. So an example of this is how we introduced in Weaviate the different storage tiers. The hot, warm, and cold storage. So you can store in memory, on disk, and in storage buckets. Because we've seen that if you take those broader set of AI cases, people actually want to store data differently based on the use case that they have. This is something we probably would not have seen if we would just had kept this narrow focus on the index, right? So that change from the pure technology mindset to the business mindset, I needed to make that change in my head. So when I talk to my co-founders, the CTO, if I talk to our VP of product now, and so on and so forth, marketing, growth, they give me input, and then I put in a cocktail shaker and I shake it, and then I need to somehow correlate that with the market and how the market is growing. And that's how I articulate it to the team, and that's how I articulate or come up with that vision, but then I need the help from the team to execute on it. Does it make sense?
100%. And for us, we try to do similar things. Like we've got the product vision, collaboration for mission critical work, and we have our customer base, which is sort of defense, intelligence, security, and critical infrastructure. And we try to do the high level vision. I'm kind of curious how it sounds like you do a lot of trust, and it sounds like you're a little hands off, but what happens if stuff starts floating kind of a little, like I think what happens is, for example, you say, okay, focus on the customer. Everyone has a different view of what the customer is. Support thinks about tickets, right? Sales thinks about revenue. Engineering thinks about what is the code change that we will do but there's not sort of like one customer view. So when you think about how do we create a vision that serves the customer, how do you manage all the different disciplines having slightly different articulations of the vision based on their context?
I love this example, because that was something actually we had also with Weaviate. So I noticed that if I would say something as customer first or customer is the most important, too abstract, too vague. So I started to do my own research. And then, of course, you inevitably end up with Amazon, right? What they refer to as a customer obsession. That how they define it, which I don't like that, because for whatever reason, we like the term customer obsession. But if I say my neighbor is obsessed about me, that's kind of scary. So it's like I was like, nah, that's not it. So what I came up with was what I like to refer to as customer empathy. So I said the way that we can make the customer number one is that every time when we talk about a customer internally or to the customer, we talk from their perspective. So we put ourselves in their shoes, and then argue back from that. So let me give you a very pragmatic example. let's say that a customer says, "Oh, I have a problem, right? I have a problem with my setup or those kind of things," and it ends up with support. Then maybe the support team might look at it and go like, "Well, no, we actually told you, but you didn't read it or you missed it." Now you can of course never say that to a customer. So that's why we came up with like the customer is always right, because we had this empathy thing in the back of our minds where we said we place ourselves in the position of the customer. For whatever the fact that the customer missed this piece of information is therefore our mistake. We should have communicated it more clearly. We should have, and so on and so forth. And then you work your way back from the customer. So to put this to recap this, to answer your question. So this is what I meant earlier when I said you speak from a level of abstraction in my role, but not too abstract. So if I go customer first, that's too abstract. But if you say like we need to show empathy for the customer by always reasoning from their perspective, then it's still abstract enough for a support team, a researcher, or a salesperson to make that their own. But it also is concrete enough for a way of thinking and a mental model on how people should do that. So that's how I think about that.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I mean, we have that. You've articulated our values. Like we actually have the customer obsession value. Customer centric, and I'm like, oh, that explains why, because we do have this confusion, because I love that concept of customer empathy. The customer obsession value actually says start and end with the customer, but I don't think people get that. I think they just get the headline, and they're just like, and sometimes it goes backwards where it's just like whatever the customer just said, that's the most important thing, like for like last in first out. So I'm totally with you on that articulation.
Yeah, and I like to also, it's I also, but that's just more my personality. If you see the big Amazon, right, that they have like that phrase customer obsession, then I always like, let's see if we can improve a bit on that, right? So it's like I like to and not always just accept whatever comes out of these big, very successful organizations, and see if we can, because what's also important, Ian, is that I don't know if you agree with this, but this is related to us being relatively young in what we're doing, right? So younger. And I once had a conversation with my dad, and my dad said, he said like, Bob, now running this bigger business, don't you find this difficult because you never, done that before? And I said, no, I have a very good reason that I have not done it before. It's because I just don't have an age. I needed to get here, right? To put in the work, pay my dues together. And I said, but there's one thing that these famous, very successful operator CEOs, the men and women in their 50s and 60s who have done it a couple of times before, I said, there's one thing that I bring to the table that they don't have. And that is the zeitgeist. What we bring to the table as new founder CEOs is the culture and society in which we grew up. So the way we like to build companies, simple examples of that might be a stance you might take about remote or hybrid work. This might be a stance you take on how you communicate to the outside world, how you do marketing. This might be seen in how you use social media to do stuff. The fact that we're now talking on a podcast about this, right? So that is the new thing that you bring to the table as leadership, I think, is the now. Like, this is how we do this now. And that's very important because that's how companies evolve. And so back to that example of Amazon, of the customer obsession, I know I'm aware that you use it, but I'm of the opinion that for me, that language doesn't feel as now. So words like empathy and those kind of things seem to be more now. And that's what I try to weave into the story of how we're building the company. I hope that makes sense, but that's how I look at it.
Oh, I completely love that. And yeah, I'm going to go back to my leadership team and just like, we might need to revisit this. This feels very 2015. It's like
No, I really mean that, because it's like the new people that's what they bring to the table. That's how they grew up, what they watch on television, how they start. I see that now with the generation under me, how they make stuff, that is fantastic. And I can't do that. It's not so they are now learning, and then they will start their businesses in a couple of years, and then they use that again. So that's how that keeps evolving. And I think that's super excited, because that's what makes new companies emerge and find their place in the market. And I think that's a great thing.
Oh, I totally love that. It makes me feel like so young and so old at the same time. Just like, I mean, you remember like when we were young, it's like, oh, this sort of like internet email thing, and everyone's sort of like just writing letters with like postage stamps, like that long ago. What does it mean? I mean, just 2 seconds ago is like, what does it mean to be a digital native, to use social media, to use mobile, to use all these things? And now it's about how do you be AI native, right? How do you wake up in a world where you got like, wait a minute, I have like a gazillion servers at my disposal that can just, load the whole internet and answer questions. Like that is today. That's a one-way door. But what does it mean to be AI native? Like, what does it mean for like, if we're starting a company literally today, right? Like, how would it be different? So, one of the things that I hear is, hey, Google is like 25% of the code generated, they announced is AI written. So, and us, I'm sort of like, man, I'll just say like internally, there's some folks that are leaning in and forward, and not all the tools are there yet, and they're just like plowing ahead. And there's folks that are like, I tried it, it's not working, I can't get it to work, I'm just going to do it the old way. And it's a little inconsistent that we've seen. We're leaning and we're leading and pushing hard the innovation piece. What's it like with your culture? Like, how are you thinking about like? I mean, you're in the ground zero of some of this AI native technology. What does it look like for your developers, for your mindsets, for your workflows with sort of these AI tools and being part of that whole platform?
So this is a wonderful question. So so one thing that I observe, and let me argue this from the perspective of our community of users and customers, right? So that is maybe easier. So some people, they use the previous paradigm and then use the new database to fit that for the new stuff that's happening, but in that previous paradigm. So the way that they talk about the way they build software and those kind of things is the previous paradigm. There's nothing bad about that. That's great, because that has been so successful. So there's a lot of stuff in there that we can reuse. But there's also this group, and you often see this at hackathons and those kind of things, and then again, age plays a role here. So because young people have something wonderful, and that's that they're naive about the world. But I'm going to give you a very pragmatic example. But the beauty of that is that you don't know what you don't know. So you build new stuff, and by building that new stuff, new markets emerge. And that's how then our technology is used. So let me give you an example. I saw somebody, and I believe it was in the upstairs in the ferry building in SF, but I might be wrong. But what they did is that they basically prompted the model, and they told the model your SQL database, and I started just write SQL. And they inserted stuff in the database, they queried the database, and the thing did actually pretty well. And of course, it was slow and that kind of stuff, but it didn't matter. And now somebody from the previous paradigm would say like, oh, you can't do this because, the way you need to store this, blah, blah, yada, yada, yada. I get all that, but the fact that they started doing that they now starting to make for example, Weaviate that stores that information around it, they start to use it to build that new paradigm. Another example that I saw was somebody who had the LLM be the front-end framework. So he didn't say, I need your help, LLM, to write better React or anything. No. He said, I'm literally going to copy-paste the HTML in the LLM. And then I said, okay, this was posted in a sign-up form. Store this in the database. And the LLM actually did a pretty good job. And that is that new paradigm, what I like to refer to as AI native. That is that people really use these models, and in this case, in combination with Weaviate, to do these new pure AI things. And are they there yet? No. But the inference gets faster, inference gets cheaper, and slowly but certainly you see that they're getting there. And that is where they get very excited about, right? Because if you look at our business, the majority, the 98% of what we're selling is all the previous paradigm adopting AI. But what makes me so excited is that 2% that tries to do something really, really, really new, what I refer to as AI native. And that tends to correlate with the new generation. Because just, how they look at the world, the thing they don't know what they don't know. They start to play around with these kind of things. And that excites me a lot.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think there's so much being done. Maybe one last topic, just I'm so interested in a bit. How do you think about, and this is a question I get, security and compliance, but mainly security in sort of like this new world of AI native? There's so much things that we can do. We're having so much debate internally about like, well, what do we enable? I'm like, okay, you can disable it by default, but let people turn it on. But there's even fear of like letting people enable certain use cases just because of injection attacks, all the things you can do, permissions. Like, is there, and I think, is there something that you'd go to as like a framework for this sort of new type of security or analysis around the risks of, just classical security compliance, not even the hallucination stuff, but classical security compliance with AI assistance?
So this is another excellent question. So I was recently talking to a startup that they were thinking about approaching this also from an LLM and a RAG with the database perspective. And what was super interesting to see is, again, here we can plot this on the status quo way of doing it or the new way of doing it. So the status quo way of doing it, and we support this in Weaviate too, right? Because a lot of customers want this, right? That can just be traditional RBAC, right? Where you say when you have a RAG pipeline, this document can go into the model to give information, but that piece of info can't. That is that, and it works well, and that's just the traditional RBAC way of doing it. But this startup that I was talking to, they said, "Hey, we want to do something about security, but do you think we can do something in those layers and with our back and that kind of stuff?" And I said, "Sure, you can." I said, "But why don't you use the opportunity now to try to see if you can do this on a token level or anything, right? So that you say, because sometimes there's some information in a document and then the RBAC is very binary, yes access, no access. But some person is allowed to know a little bit of what's in there, and somebody else is allowed to know everything that's in there, right? So that could be, let's say that you have an HR system and you have a piece of document that contains salary information. Then somebody in HR would be able to see the complete thing. Other employees would not be allowed to see it, but maybe a manager might be able to see a little bit. So that you can tell the LLM, well, this is our company policy. Now determine if somebody has access, what part of this piece of information they have access to or not. And that is that new way of dealing with security. And again, the first way how I said it, that's how it's done right now. That's how people implement it. That's what the majority of the customers do. But I also would like to urge people, this is the time to also investigate and go down the path of doing it the new way. That includes security and how we think about information security and how we think about privacy, or not how we think about privacy, but how we think about the systems we built to adhere to the privacy rules. Also there, AI native is possible. We haven't really seen it yet, but people are experimenting with it. So to try to answer your question, I see this really in two ways. One is very traditional, to be honest, with RBAC, that kind of stuff, which again is important, but there's also this opportunity for the new way, and that makes me very excited.
Yeah, totally love it. Yes. There's so many There's so much to discuss there, and it's like, I completely agree. That's a great example of doing it the new way, where you actually use the AI native sort of structure and tools to do the security and compliance, because the RBAC is going to be so kludgy in so many different ways, and it's not going to work actually, because you can start artificially generating sensitive data from non-sensitive data. So like there's a whole bunch of limitations there. Bob, thank you so much. This is absolutely fantastic. Is there places online, social, to learn more about Weaviate or yourself?
Yes, so you can do it the old-fashioned way. That's going to Google and type in Weaviate, and you find everything on LinkedIn, the website, the documentation, GitHub, everything. You can also do it the modern way, and that's prompt a model and say like, "Where can you tell me about Weaviate?" And it will probably point you to the same places. But you can find me online. I'm very active on especially on LinkedIn. Our website, the documentation. We had something great that was released today. So Google's Vertex AI, today they launched the Weaviate with the Weaviate integration. So you can do these things as well. So you can find it there. Any way you want to run it, you have to try to not find anything about Weaviate if you search for it. So we're everywhere.
Excellent, thank you, Bob. We'll include more sort of raw data in our show notes to prompt those models.
Exactly. Thanks so much, Ian. This was such a wonderful conversation. It was really great.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much, Bob. Thanks so much for listening. If you like this content, please join our LinkedIn group. Please thumbs up, please comment, please subscribe. We'd love to bring more of this content to you.